I spent an entire month this past June teaching soft skills in Asunción, Paraguay. Having developed the course over the previous couple of months, I felt quite secure and trusted my material, and the only thing that worried me a little bit was whether my native Spanish would be good enough to teach a course in it, never having done it before, and my academic and professional career having taken place in English and in Hebrew. What I didn't foresee was how emotionally charged the topics of the course would turn out to be. Who knew subjects such as flexibility, punctuality, attitude, and behavior had such emotional potential? Every time the students spoke about their families and their lives, they got a bit teary-eyed, and in what seemed as an automatic response, they switched from Spanish to Guarani, the second official language of Paraguay. I am multilingual myself, and so I am fully aware of the role that each language plays in a polyglot's life. To this day, almost 40 years since I moved from Mexico to Israel, I count and do calculations using my multiplication tables in Spanish, and I can recite again in Spanish the entire periodic table of the elements. I do. Hidrógeno, litio, sodio, potasio, rubidio, cesio. I can do it, just so that you know I'm not lying. My professional language is English. I did my PhD in the United States, but I've been teaching in Israel for years in Hebrew. And in conversation with my parents, quite often Yiddish plays a central role, usually when talking about children or joking, and I am not quite sure what language I dream in. Thus, I thought I understood, at least in theory, the need to switch to Guarani in certain contexts. But my conversations about it with my students revealed a pattern. They always used the history of their country, and specifically one of their wars, as well as their political situations over the past few decades, to explain the place of Guarani in their social and emotional lives. They spoke, for example, of the War of 70 with a passion and involvement that did not reveal at first that it was the War of 1870. Only later did I realize that this was one of the seminal events in the shaping of Paraguayan identity, as was life under a dictatorship that ended as late as 1989. But I needed to delve deeper into the connection of these events to their bilingual culture. Thus, this paper that I hope is the basis for further research and many visits to wonderful Paraguay. The time allotted for my talk does not allow for even a brief history of Paraguay, so just as context, here are a few facts about one of the deepest scars in Paraguayan and indeed Latin American history, the War of the Triple Alliance, a conflict between Paraguay and a coalition of Argentina, Brazil, and Uruguay that began in 1865 and ended in 1870. The war, known as the War of 70 or the Great War, was amongst the worst military defeats ever inflicted on a modern nation state. As much as 60% of the population and 90% of Paraguayan men died in combat, disease, and starvation. From a population of about 1,300,000 at the beginning of the war, Paraguay was reduced at its end to about 200,000, and of those, only 10% were males, almost all of them old men and children. The war is little known outside the region, and in Paraguay, its moral ambiguities have caused generations of leaders to shroud it in myth. It is a tragedy that still defines the country. The fact that the war is little known abroad is no coincidence, according to journalist Benjamin Fernandez Bogado. Paraguay is an insular country, and in its citizens' mind, a scene of danger, conspiracy, and death. For Paraguayans, Bogado explains, success is a prelude to danger. When the national football team scores, it makes them nervous, and they panic. Modern Paraguay is flat, landlocked, and steamy. Its foreign influence limited to 2 giant dams on its borders, soybean exports that feed Chinese livestock, and the free-for-all bazaar of Ciudad del Este, a border town where cheap electronics and clothes are sold in public, and arms deals and Hezbollah fundraisers take place in private. Guarani, still spoken by 80% of the population, renders time differently from Western languages. The future is uncertain. The word for tomorrow means if the sun rises. The past is divided between what happened and what was supposed to but did not. If you quit a seminary, you're a would-have-been priest, and a broken engagement yields a would-have-been spouse. This grammar is like a backpack you can never take off, says Alejandra Peña, former National Museum director. The semi-nomadic character of the Guarani culture kept them from leaving any material remains like the temples or statues of the Aztecs, of the Maya, or the Inca. But their most valuable cultural legacy is their language. Guarani was for a long time an exclusively oral tongue. During the European colonization, it maintained its centrality as a result of the fact that the Spaniards married several wives, and their children learned Guarani from their mothers and Spanish from their fathers. Also, some Spaniards tried to learn it and also teach it, and in order to do so, they introduced writing to the language. In order to reach a wider popular audience, Spanish texts were translated into Guarani using short grammatical annotations, albeit in a very inefficient way, since they tried to represent sounds of Guarani which did not exist in Spanish or in the Spanish alphabet, but they became the basis for future use when Guarani script was finally standardized in its present form in 1950. During the Big War, Guarani was used by the press and in military communications. The lack of uniformity in its spelling, especially when using the telegraph, where speed was important, caused the president to convene a Congress of Linguistics to establish the rule for transcription using a unified alphabet, which was immediately put into use in the war. Newspapers appeared that took pleasure in exalting the Guarani soul, publishing poetry that tried to encourage the Paraguayan people during the bloody war. Guarani was a tool for union and consolation. Once the war was over, Guarani found itself persecuted again for not being the language of the new owners. School programs were checked to make sure that the wild tongue remained out of them, but the population did not follow the small ruling elite, and as Guarani was the only resource that had not been destroyed by the war, it continued to exist, recapturing the orality of which it was always proud, in spite of the arrogant Spanish adjective guarango, which means savage who speaks Guarani. As I mentioned before, I spent a month in Asunción teaching 2 sections of a course in soft skills that I developed for Paraguay's National Service of Professional Promotion. My students were all adult professionals in various areas who, aside from their regular jobs, take part in the training of Paraguay's young in all areas, including agriculture, automotive mechanics, hairdressing, computer literacy, etc. In the process of training, the institution realized that aside from the hard skills required to become capable professionals in each one of these fields, it was necessary to also expose their youth to the social abilities that distinguish a good worker from a great one. And so we talked about teamwork, the importance of helping others, as well as knowing how to ask for help, good manners, body language, motivation, and more. All of these, of course, are skills that are important not only in the workplace, but in our social lives generally. And this led to a very dynamic course, rich in stories offered by my students as examples for the different points made or the topics that we spoke about. During the telling of these stories, my students often switched to Guarani or Yopara, a mixture of Spanish and Guarani, and sometimes burst out laughing. Someone had told a joke. They tried to translate it for me, but most of the time I didn't find it funny. This was not surprising, as jokes almost never translate well, but there was something additional. It was less the joke itself and more how it was told that seemed to be funny. Their body language changed when they spoke Guarani. There was an uncommon level of expression there. I observed them carefully, and there was a clear pattern. Obviously, Spanish dominated my course, but our conversations switched to Guarani as soon as the tone of what we were discussing became emotional, playful, angry, or heated in any way. This was so obvious, and it stood out so clearly that I couldn't help but point it out to them, and they loved trying to explain it to me. One of my students said that in mostly Spanish-speaking families, the most common reason to convert to Guarani has to do with the children's behavior. When they misbehave, Guarani is stronger. It's faster, she said. Another student said that they call a rumor that passes from one mouth to another meat radio, steak radio. Someone falling asleep is said to be fishing, due to the similar movement of the head when trying to keep one's head up and pulling on the fishing rod to check if there's a fish. Let's kill worms means let's have a drink. And dog sweat means futile work or useless sacrifice. All of these are good examples, I believe, of some of the characteristics of oral thought, according to Walter Ong, among them the idea that orality is close to the human life world and that it is situational. In the absence of the analytic categories that depend on writing to structure knowledge at a distance from lived experience, oral cultures conceptualize and verbalize their knowledge with close references to the immediate, familiar interaction of human beings, and they tend to use concepts in situational, operational frames of reference that are minimally abstract, as in fishing. Paraguayan linguist David Galeano Oliveira, author of 2 books of jokes in Guarani and Yopara, is quoted as saying that in comparison to Guarani, Spanish is much poorer and does not have the same taste. He explains that this may be due to Guarani's polysynthetic nature. A variation of prefixes and suffixes are added to root words that lend a sense of time, mode, aspect, function, number, and degree, creating a sense of detail that cannot be easily translated. And he adds that the use of Guarani delivers the sense of intimacy, place, and community, all of which are situationally defined. Another characteristic of orality is that it is agonistically toned, and so were some of my students' verbal performances. They constantly used proverbs and riddles to engage others in verbal and intellectual combat. If they got mad, they didn't simply say, "Get out of here," but used the saying best translated as, "Soap to your feet so that you slide away from here." A student told me that politicians pepper their speeches with Guarani to rally the public, and that newspapers mix Guarani into their headlines to get people to buy the newspapers. Reading about it later, I also found a quote from a young lawyer who speaks almost exclusively Spanish, who said she saves a list of Guarani swear words in her phone to use in text messages with friends, even though their exact meanings often elude her. The agonistic character of their culture is clearest from their sayings. When someone physically gets in between 2 people, they will say, "Excuse me," said the ear of corn, referring to farmers who used old corn cobs in place of toilet paper. Sorry. "I boiled the water and someone else drank the mate" is used to complain about doing work and someone else taking credit for it. Mate is one of their most popular drinks. And another saying is, "Paraguayans don't pee alone," and it is used when someone supports someone else's action or opinion for no apparent reason and without thought. All of these were not easy for my students to translate into Spanish for me. It was clear to me that their 2 languages coexist, but point to very different experiences of the social. Warha an expert in sociolinguistics, describes some of the situations in which each is used. Spanish, he says, is the language used for government business in conversation with strangers who are well-dressed, with foreigners, and in most business transactions. Guarani is used with friends, with strangers who are poorly dressed, in the confessional, when they tell jokes or make love. Paraguayans abroad will speak Guarani amongst themselves to express solidarity, especially when they find themselves among other South Americans, Spanish-speaking South Americans. Males may drink in Guarani, but use more and more Spanish as they feel alcohol kicking in, as Spanish is the language of power and control. Courtship may begin in Spanish, but if the relationship deepens, it will proceed in Guarani. In other words, or in Walter Ong's terms, oral Guarani is empathetic and participatory, and literate Spanish is objectively distanced. Paraguay's bilingual culture is a fascinating example of the continuum that Deborah Tannen talks about between interpersonal involvement and message content that moves speakers between fixity and novelty of expression, personalization and generalization, and internal and external evaluation. I built my course in Spanish, but its actual teaching would have not been the same without oral Guarani, or in Havelock's terms, without my students' close, empathetic, communal identification with the known. It was hard for my students to translate for me, because what needed to be translated were not signs or meanings, but complex interpretations of their ways of inhabiting the world and making sense of it. Orality is the organizational principle for Guarani culture. In Paraguay, written history does not replace the oral world, but it invokes it. Oral culture permeates every aspect of Paraguay's emotional life. Their tradition remains a part of their cultural awareness, and their past remains alive in their minds. Perhaps this explains why they talk about the War of 1870 as if it had taken place in 1970, and it also explains the fact that the term "ñe" means both word and soul. More than just information passes between speakers and listeners. They exchange word souls. Thank you very much.